Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by Jan, who's an advanced photographer from Seattle. Jan shot this with a full-frame sensor Canon Mark III 1DS, 24 to 105 zoom at 50 millimeters, and at f8 exposed the file for 1/160th of a second. Starting something new today, I'm going to be doing from time to time on the Daily Critique. I'm going to start talking about the ideas connected to cinematic visual design, how we might work with that in our still photography. Would love to hear your feedback about whether you think that it's helpful or not. So let's get right into it today. I love the lighting design in this image. I think Jan has done a really masterful job of lighting this portrait. I love the fact that the highest quantity of light and the main contrast is here in the main subject in the eyes and in the top half of the face. There's a real beautiful flow of light on the face, but this is definitely the most dynamic part of the lighting, and then all those supporting parts of the image are sort of really beautifully, softly underlit. And I love the catch lights in the eyes. Also, really beautiful qualities of line in the pose, really beautiful space shapes. And when you look at just sort of the overall framing, the overall qualities of line, the overall feeling of form and shape in the image, there's also quite a bit of unity based on repetition. Really beautiful repetition from foreground to background in terms of the feeling of form and dimension and space shape and quality of line, and that really plays beautifully off of qualities of line and the way the model has been posed here in just space shapes. And really enjoying the rhythm here in the image, and very rich from a color standpoint. Red and black, very, very powerful color combination, and those are the two main color ideas that I'm getting when I look at the image. For today, let's just start off and talk about three very basic ideas and then sort of tie them together in some ways when it comes to the way, in a classical sense, that cinema talks about designing its shots. We're going to talk about three planes of movement, and we're also going to be using the word axis. So plane and axis will be interchangeable. So we're going to talk about the X, Y, and Z planes of movement. X movement is from left to right, right to left is horizontal movement. Y movement is up and down. And Z movement is, to me, the most powerful visual plane because it's where we suggest that the viewer can actually move into the design of our shot. We know that that's an illusion. We know that we're just dealing ultimately here with the two dimensions, but we can create the illusion of the third dimension, and in cinema this is called the Z dimension, the idea of moving through. So first let's talk about the X axis, the horizontal movement. You know, the ideas of visual design are based on first of all natural law of the universe, things like the qualities of light at the most basic level of energy, things that we really can't change. If they do change, then who knows what will happen, but we probably wouldn't be here anymore. And then other elements of visual design or ideas in visual design are more based on things like trends. You could call them cultural trends, social trends, things that may be relative to a period in time and history, or relative to a country or a part of the world. But visual design isn't just pulled from thin air. It's based on the things that we experience in our lives as human beings, that go anywhere from etched in stone laws of the universe to things that we could call sort of cultural or social laws, and those obviously are a lot more subjective. And so what's really interesting about the x-axis of movement is that in the West we read from left to right. So from a visual design standpoint, it's easier for the viewer to move from left to right. And because of that, from the earliest days of cinema, the hero or the protagonist or ideas that would move the story forward a lot of times would come in from the left and move to the right, and opposing concepts, the anti-hero, the antagonist, those concepts would come in from the right and move to the left. When we combine that with a very basic scenario connected to the y-axis, which is just the idea of gravity, it's much easier to flow downhill. So from high to low or up to down is easier movement than from low to high. It's interesting when we combine those two ideas, then we can start to talk about diagonal movement. And we've talked quite a bit on the Daily Critique about how powerful diagonals are. So if we were to combine these two ideas and look at the major diagonals, we can draw a diagram here that might be really interesting for us to think about, particularly when we're designing an image like this. It's a pose shot, it's in the studio, we're sort of putting this shot together, potentially one element at a time. Easiest diagonal movement, so we'll call this number one, would be from top left to bottom right, and we'll put an arrow here so you can distinguish all the lines if you want to do a screenshot. The second easiest line of movement would be what Jan has in this image, would be from top right to bottom left. The next easiest line of movement would be from bottom left to top right, and then the hardest diagonal line of movement would be from bottom right, where we're now combining the idea of coming in from the right, going against the grain right to left, and having to go uphill. Hardest diagonal would be from bottom right if we're implying visual movement to top left. And what's really interesting in terms of thinking about that in this image is we could really sort of think about these diagonals and implied movement as sort of positions, you know, in the hierarchy of, if we're talking about making it easier for the viewer or going more with the idea of natural law. So here we've got gravity combined with more of a cultural or social law. We could literally say that the 1, 2, and 3 and 4 position for the diagonals is best or easiest to potentially worst or most difficult. Again, subjective, and we can decide when or not we want to work with this. But what's fascinating about this image is we can just flip it, and we can go from the idea of a 2 position diagonal to a 1 position diagonal. So if we flip this, we now have movement that is the easiest for the viewer for the reasons that we've mentioned. And if we get rid of all that and look at these changes, just be curious to hear from Jan, to hear from the model if she sees this, and to hear from the audience how you feel about the difference in the image. How do you move in the image? How do you feel about the image overall, and does it have an effect on you? Let's talk about the z-plane of movement. We said that's very powerful. And really, the two things I would think about changing in this image have to do with the z-axis, or the third dimension. And most of it has to do with this is a subject matter, that part of the arm, and the posing cube. This feels a little bit cut off to me. It feels a little bit incongruent with the other arm. Just the lighting and the way that it's cut off, this starts to look like something else besides the other arm for me. And the posing cube itself, I question the color here. If we're talking about z-axis of movement, a lot of times we're talking about getting our main subject to separate from near to far. And the interesting thing to me about this color is it's sort of doing two things that might seem like opposites, but for me anyway, it's doing two things that cut down on z-axis movement or simplicity. In some areas in here, this fabric starts to harmonize some of these sort of coppered or very desaturated kind of bronzed skin tones. And so if it's the same as the main subject, then instead of there being an illusion of separation and this being closer, the model being in the middle and this being the background, if it harmonizes, these two things come on par with each other and we lose that feeling of depth on the z-axis. But when I get out into here and this pattern and this other sort of lighter color, I almost start to get the feeling out in here of a completely different universe in terms of color. It starts to become a color unto itself, and then that starts to, on this very powerful plane of movement, starts to create a subject that is potentially more powerful than the main subject because it's different on this z-axis. And so we can't obviously, you know, move the arms around and do a pose here where you know, I would think about a variation where we bring this arm around, bring this arm around, bring the posing cube, let me get rid of some of this stuff, bring the posing cube actually closer to the camera, maybe the hands clasp, and you shoot over that, create more of a lead-in with flow of focus and line to the face as a variation. But we can change the color of this. I'm going to flip it again, and please hear me say I did a hideous job of changing the color. I did it very quickly and very rough. If we change that to red, what happens for me now is that foreground idea separates from the model, and the model seems to stand out more on the implied z-axis of movement, and instead of having the potential to harmonize the model, it harmonizes with the background, which ties close and furthest away together in a way that also for me simplifies movement on the z-axis. It would just be really interesting to hear what other people think about that. Hopefully this is a good start and a good introduction to Sometimes on the Daily Critique talking about visual design for still photographs as it might relate to designing shots for cinema. Would really love to hear whether you think this is helpful or not. I want to say a huge thank you to Jan for all the ways he supports the TME community. This is such a beautiful shot, and I want to say a big thank you to all of you for being here. Hope to see you again real soon on The Mindful Eye.